Good morning, or whatever it is. I'm Doug, and this channel is the starting point for the upcoming comprehensive housing revolution. If you're fed up with our housing situation getting worse and worse, despite the efforts of a lot of well-intentioned people, activists, housing think tanks, housing manufacturers, etc., you've come to the right place. This video will give you a brief idea of what is to come in this ongoing series. Now, I'm just some drummer accountant dude who's been contemplating our dysfunctional housing system since I was in my teens. During that time, my mother became a realtor and I started hearing lots of horror stories. I also heard all of the narratives about why our housing system wasn't working, but these narratives just weren't adding up. I knew there was more to it. I heard all of the strategies about how to fix our housing system, but after several decades of our housing system getting worse and worse, it's safe to say these strategies have all failed. Why have they failed? Because they've failed to acknowledge, much less effectively address, the fundamental dysfunctional systemic roots of our land and housing system. So we're going to break all of this down in this series, and you will get to a point where you will see that the current state of our dysfunctional housing system was inevitable. There's no way it could not have gotten to this point. And sooner or later, you will see this loud and clear. Lee. We'll go in depth on some of the popular narratives and proposed solutions and break down why they fall just as short today as they did decades ago. For instance, narratives like, well, it's just a supply issue. That's all it is. Well, we're going to break that down and all of the NIMBYism, zoning, regulations, permitting, etc., and see the ongoing futility of attempting to create an adequate supply of housing without first effectively addressing the deeper systemic roots of our dysfunctional land and housing system. And we're going to see why it is that when we actually do manage to get some new housing supply, we're not getting the supply that the market is in most need of. We'll see that we can never get the supply of housing that is appropriate to the real needs of the housing market until we comprehensively transform our dysfunctional land and housing system by its deepest roots. And we'll go in depth on the narratives like, we just need to pay people a living wage, or more recently, we need to give them enough UBI that they'll be able to afford the cost of living. We'll talk about how these narratives focus solely on the left side of the equation and completely ignore the right side. Well, what's that equation? Wages are less than costs of living. In other words, the pundits and politicians are obsessed with getting more money to people while utterly failing to address the root problem, constantly inflating and hyperinflating costs of living, especially those of land and housing. We'll review the ineffectiveness of this strategy as well as exactly who is ultimately benefiting from it. We'll see that as history has shown us, whenever we raise minimum wage, we're always back at the table in a few years or so begging for another wage increase. Why is this? Is this strategy a real solution or just a temporary band-aid that we have to keep replacing every so often because we're forever failing to deal with the real, deeper roots of the problem? Now, not that I'm against raising minimum wage or maybe even implementing some kind of UBI for that matter. The problem is repeatedly implementing these types of policies without concurrently addressing the real roots of the problem. So we're going to get into all of this in more detail, and eventually we're going to see that this strategy is basically a giant funnel for the massive transfer of wealth going from those putting their time and energy into the real economy, those workers and employers who are putting real time and energy into producing real goods and providing real legitimate services, to the asset class controlling land and housing who are making money and building wealth doing very little other than just sitting on their assets. We'll get some great historical perspective into the deepest systemic roots of our dysfunctional land and housing system. We'll talk about the conflict the founding fathers had between their amazing vision for our country, as long as you are a white male, and their own self-interests. Well, which path do you think they chose? Their amazing vision for our country or their own self-interests? Well, we'll talk about how their choices then have brought about the ugly land and housing scenario we have today. In addition to breaking all of that down, we're going to talk about the caveat James Madison advocated that, had it been implemented, would have avoided today's housing dysfunction. We'll talk about Thomas Jefferson's proposal that also would have avoided much of today's housing dysfunction. We'll talk about Abraham Lincoln's ideas fourscore later when the problems with our land system were becoming apparent. And we'll see that his ideas would have forever rectified the problems in our land and housing system that are plaguing us today. Soon thereafter, we will talk about the cheeseburgerization, aka the cheeseburgerization of housing, and the ensuing speculation and financialization that is now rampant and is a massive contributor to housing's hyperinflation. We'll break down the many ramifications of the two deepest roots of our affordable housing crisis working in tandem, and the sordid effects this lethal combo have had not just on housing, but on the economy and the ethos of our country. We'll talk about how these fundamental roots have diverted labor from necessity to luxury and diverted capital funding from startup companies with the potential to make huge positive impacts on society and our economy to instead non-productive, speculative, inflationary land and housing investments that are keeping our country so far from reaching our potential. In fact, there's a whole web of secondary effects, far-ranging and seldomly talked about, that we will delve into. And of course, we will talk about solutions, not the ineffective, Exboxtricative solutions that have become so commonplace when we brainstorm solutions from within the confines of our dysfunctional land and housing system, but solutions that come to mind as soon as we exboxtricate ourselves and look at the entire system holistically. We'll also break down the narratives often heard from those profiteering via our exploitative housing system in their attempts to warrant their actions and to make the case in vain that we should just leave the system just as it is. We will also get into some basic economics, as it's crucial that everyone have a working understanding of fundamental economic principles such as supply and demand, inflation, and money supply. You see, the economy has been weaponized by those who do understand economics, who have the means to exploit the economy, and who are able to influence economic policy. Like any competition, be it sports or chess or whatever, understanding the game, its strategies, and the strategies of one's opponents are crucial if one hopes to avoid getting dominated. In our highly competitive economy, where it seems just about everyone is being forced to try and economically dominate any and everyone else, failing to understand basic economic principles is basically rolling over and saying, have at it. So come to watch these videos prepared to do some learning. Economics gets a bit abstract at times, but after a few listens and earnest attempts to understand, the basics do start to synthesize and make sense. And if I do say so myself, I believe I have come up with some effective, easy to understand methods to convey these economic concepts. So if I say something like, the inflationary effects of supply and demand are limited or unlimited by the money supply, don't worry. I will use some everyday concepts you are already familiar with to get you to that aha moment. And once you have the working knowledge of these concepts, you're going to look at the world, the economy, money, and housing differently. And remember, an informed citizenry scares the hell out of the people sitting at the top running the show. All right, and by the way, I am not selling anything or trying to get you to sign up for my free thingy so later I can get you to try up and buy my program or whatever. I'm not trying to get you to invest in anything. I'm here to get the housing revolution going, and going in the direction it must go to create meaningful, tangible, long-term changes in our land and housing system that will benefit everyday Americans for generations to come, and will benefit and elevate our country as a whole, that will bring our country to its incredible potential. If you're in, spread the word, lit the hike button, subscribe, and always hit the no box donations button. All right, that's it for this week. We'll see you next week. Over and out.